So the proposal I first came back was, okay, we abolished mandatory minimums in 1970 in the Controlled Substances Act. So if you want mandatory minimums, this should be a very extraordinary thing. You know, the maximum penalty generally for drug offense, the maximum is 15 years as we're going into this thing. And we're now considering mandatory minimums. Our House bills would have been a mandatory of 5 years up to 20 years, a mandatory of 10 years up to 40 years. Those would have been the ranges for high-level traffickers defined as by DEA as an organization that delivers hundreds of thousands of doses of drugs per month.
Okay.
High-level trafficker.
Okay. What?
Congressman Mazzoli from Louisville, Kentucky, looks at the proposal. Mr. Chairman, if we define high-level trafficker in these terms that DEA is using, we're never going to use this law in Louisville, because Louisville is not a center of the drug trade. We need lower quantities so that even though Louisville has never been a center of America's drug traffic or the global drug traffic, and it's not the place where the federal focus ought to be made, we begin to have for the purpose of having the congressman's legislation talked about in news stories, press conferences by the United States Attorney, we diluted the standards, moving from hundreds of thousands of doses. House bill ends up being, well, we're concerned about crack cocaine epidemic. 20 grams of crack would get you a mandatory minimum, you know, at 5 years up to 20 years. The bill gets reported out, no hearings, bam, 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 mandatory minimums. And so over August, while the members of Congress are all campaigning about all this wonderful, you know, crackdown legislation they've passed, staff is in the process of sort of taking the stuff from 20 different House committees and putting it together into one gigantic bill. One gigantic bill. And this gigantic bill then is like unveiled after the Labor Day recess. Members of Congress come back, and we immediately go into debate in the House of Representatives. Nobody's seen the whole package except a handful of staffers like me. None of the members of Congress know what's really in this bill.
Right.
You know, they all know that their little favorite provision is in there, something that they've issued press releases about, and that's going to go forward. So it passes the House. It goes to the Senate. And in the House, already the politics had begun to backfire. Conservatives said, you know what? We should have the death penalty in this bill. We should have the death penalty for big drug trafficking. Bill passes. You know, members saying, you know, we ought to limit the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution. There's a rule in the Constitution. There's a rule that the judges have created to make the Fourth Amendment rule against unlawful searches and seizures, unconstitutional searches and seizures. Judges have said, when police act unconstitutionally, they don't get to benefit from the evidence that they've seized. It's called the fruit of the poisonous tree.
Exactly, yes.
And so the fruit of the poisonous tree is excluded from the trial. That we don't allow in the trial between the accused and the government to introduce evidence that's been obtained in violation of the constitutional principles. It's called the exclusionary rule.
All right.
So the Republicans propose, let's eliminate that rule. Let's say evidence that's been obtained unconstitutionally will be admitted if the police officer testifies that the unconstitutional behavior he engaged in was unintentional, or that he didn't know that it violated the Constitution. He thought he was obeying the Constitution.
He was just, though he may have screwed up, he was trying his best.
Though he screwed up, he was trying his best. So that this good faith exception would, of course, totally eliminate the meaning of the protection. In other words, you'd say, we acted unconstitutionally, but it doesn't matter. We still use this evidence obtained unconstitutionally against you.
Because we were pure at heart.
Because we testified under oath that we were pure at heart. Well, This was a tremendous embarrassment, and these kinds of things got into the bill, as I recall. And the bill goes to the Senate, and it's got the death penalty in it. It's got these mandatory minimums. It's got these various things. The Senate Judiciary Committee is chaired by Strom Thurmond from South Carolina.
Yeah.
The Republican, Strom Thurmond is the president pro tem of the Senate. He's the leader of the most senior Republican. And the Republicans in the Senate say, I mean, this came from the liberals from New Jersey, Peter Rodino, our arch enemy, who defeated, who helped engineer the resignation of Richard Nixon. We can we can be tougher than them. We can do better than they. So, 20 grams of crack becomes 5 grams of crack.
Right.
Now, 5 grams is like a sweet and low packet.
Sure.
1 gram is a sweet and low packet. 5 grams.
And it takes less than a gram of cocaine to make 5 grams of crack. But go ahead.
So, if you started by saying the purpose of this bill is to focus on the highest level drug traffickers who bring tons of cocaine, who bring cargo containers of cocaine in the country, we're talking about much, much smaller people. But we have, remember, we're moving very fast. We're not yet clear on even what this does. Ask a member of Congress the difference between 5 grams, 5 milligrams, and 5 kilograms. And they'll say, I'm sorry, with all due respect, I know how much a pound is and an ounce is, but I don't quite, I get confused between the milligrams and the kilograms. All right. So it's not a body that's fluent in metric.
Right. So
the Republicans in the Senate, without having hearings, are going to make this tougher. And what had been 5 years to 20 years now becomes 5 years to 40 years. And what had been 10 years to 40 years now becomes 10 years to life. 10 years to life gets triggered by as little as 50 grams of crack cocaine. Now, when you go to a vending machine and you put 75 cents into the machine to get a bag of M&Ms out, that bag of M&Ms might have 49 or 50 grams of M&Ms. We're talking about candy bar quantity.
Sure. Mini candy bars.
Mini candy bars.
Yes.
To fast forward now, 20 years later, when we look at how the Justice Department uses this law, think of the cocaine that floods into this country. Think about the cocaine problem. Think about the relative role between the federal government and the state and local governments. The federal government does 25,000 drug cases a year across the country. The states impose each year 300,000 drug felony convictions. The 50 states. So the states have in prison 500,000 drug prisoners. The federal government has in prison 100,000 drug prisoners. Most of our punishment capacity, most of it is at the state level. What's the federal role compared to the role of the state narcotics bureau, the state police, the local narcotics bureau? Should the federal government be investigating street-level drug traffickers? Or should the federal government be investigating the international traffickers who are bringing in cargo containers, who are bringing in million-gram shipments?
Right.
Because how does that get investigated? By going overseas, by using international wiretapping, by using the most sophisticated international law enforcement tools, working with law enforcement. Because now, we're not going to really take seriously the idea that the Colombian police are going to effectively investigate and prosecute the high-level international drug traffickers who happen to live in Colombia.
Right.
Because, in fact, the Colombian police are totally corrupted.
Sure.
As are the judges, as is the Army. They're not going to do it. So if the U.S. government, our Customs Service, our DEA, our CIA, our international law capacity is not used at that level, and then reflected in what's going on in the courts, it's not being done.